All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Josh. Thanks to Sudansu for the Brahmos. That was super interesting. Very technical deep dive into the workings of React that I definitely don't understand. So this is a little bit slightly different, but also related to React, as you might be able to guess. I'm going to talk about Flareact. I don't know how to say the name. I came up with the name, and it's a terrible name because I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's a combination of Cloudflare and React into a single word. And it's got a little flame, which also doesn't make sense because Cloudflare uses like clouds as their logo. So I don't know what I was thinking. Off to a great start, though. So before I dive into what Flareact is, I want to kind of step back. And one of the biggest hurdles I've had trying to explain this to people who aren't super familiar with technology in this area is like, why is this important? Why does it matter? And how would it even be used? And so I want to take you on a journey through some hypotheticals here. Imagine you're a media company, newspaper, and you have an online presence. I choose media company because that's where I happen to work right now, but you can imagine any site that receives a lot of traffic and has lots of unique pages. And so you can imagine, hundreds, thousands, millions potentially of unique URLs that you need to render and present to an audience. These are things that, if you're at a media company, new articles might change frequently within the couple days to provide updates, but long tail year-old articles probably aren't changing that much, yet you'd still want the ability to maybe change out some sidebar contents, maybe display some different sort of audience experience things. But at the end of the day, your big requirements are like rendering your pages out and rendering them at scale, rendering them performantly, quickly, and handling all the dynamic content that you have. So what are our options, right? The first option would be to take the dynamic approach and just you have a server, or maybe your traffic is big, so you have a whole fleet of servers. Those are responding to every request. Maybe inside your application, you have like a lot of caching implemented. So maybe you're caching some parts of the page and the dynamic parts are less cached or not cached at all. When you have big waves of traffic coming to your site, you have to scale up your servers, or you see lower response times and limited resources. If you don't get a bunch of traffic, maybe it's overnight from where you're located, you're still paying for those servers, or maybe you have to build in some sort of auto scaling, right? But at the end of the day, you're going to be paying for some servers, and you're going to be managing servers, and a lot of your work is going to be built on the server side. So pros and cons there, definitely. Definitely leans toward dynamic sites, and you're supporting those really well. But another option, number two, would be like the static answer to that. And so in this second scenario, you would maybe render out each page or a variant of a page into a static file and cache it, pre-cache it, or even store it somewhere in the cloud. And so a truly static rendered site would have almost zero server capabilities or responsibilities at request time. And so obviously that's really great. And here's a picture of a printing press, because it's kind of like printing out newspapers. Once they're printed, they don't change. You don't need to worry about scaling anything, but really great performance, really fast delivery. If your servers go down, maybe your CMS goes down, you're not in trouble because your audience experience lives as a static page. But like I mentioned with the dynamic side, if you have changing content, or you need to deploy a change across maybe all your old articles, maybe you have a new, new color of a nav bar. I don't know, that would require you to recompute and republish all those old static pages, which isn't terribly efficient, especially if you have a lot of unique articles. And so up to this point, we've kind of had to choose between a dynamic approach or a static approach, number one and number two. But what if there's a number three? And recently I've been thinking a lot about this. especially since this framework called Next.js came out with a really cool concept recently. If you're not familiar, Next.js is a React framework. It's been around for a few years now. It's grown tremendously. It's pretty popular, but it lets you render React sites in a somewhat opinionated way. They are it started out as a traditional server-side rendered React framework, right? Great for SEO because your server's responding with actual HTML markup of the initial page view, and then it sprinkles in the interactivity later. And recently, Next.js introduced static site generation into their capabilities in a recent version, and this kind of like, I don't know, it's a big step for the JAMStack, as they call it. A way to kind of pre-render a select set of pages, but then the big, I mean, so right, so this is number 2, right, the static option, but the big catching point with this is that they're offering incremental revalidation. This is actually huge because it lets you have a hybrid model between dynamic and static. You have the performance of a static site, but in the background, it is incrementally revalidating those pages and regenerating. It might be incremental regeneration, I'm not sure, but it's regenerating those static views behind the scenes without affecting an end user's response time. Incredible for scale, incredible for dynamic sites because you're not taxing your back end APIs or your resources there. And it can be hosted in a lot of different places on a simple node server, on Vercel's, the network that the company that builds Next.js, which is an open source library, Netlify. You could host it on a custom node server on Heroku. The big kind of magic, I don't know. So I guess the developer API for this is a function that you define in your page component. Next uses page components. They're React components that are literally just act as a page, which creates a new endpoint. But you define a new function on your page and you export it, and it's called get static props, and that tells your component what the initial props need to be. Next uses that to statically generate that page ahead of time at deploy time so that the latest request will come in and be really, really fast. Here's an example of it this is an Next.js code from their docs, but you can see that above, this is the blog component here. At the top, it's iterating through a list of posts, which are provided as a prop. Those are provided by get static props, and then get static props is fetching out to an external endpoint, and then it's returning those. So these are all generated at deploy time, like I said, and cached forever as static pages. The incremental revalidation comes into play here when you pass a revalidate prop parameter back with your props. And so it knows that at most once every second, when a request comes in, Next will refetch this list of posts, meanwhile serving a stale version to the block or to the client component. And then the next request will then most likely have the new version. So this is really, really cool. I use it for work projects, for personal projects, and I've really enjoyed it. But at the same time, there's this thing called Cloudflare Workers, and we were briefly chatting about Cloudflare Workers during the initial period of this meetup. And Cloudflare Workers has been in the scene for a couple years. You might be familiar with Cloudflare. It is originally kind of a CDN infrastructure company, but they've expanded now to a bunch of other offerings, including Workers. Workers is cool because it lets you write code and have it live at the edge and at these points of presence on their network. And so it's literally JavaScript. They also support some other languages, but JavaScript, and it lives at the edge instead of in a server. So you can imagine, like, if you're using Cloudflare as a CDN, there's one less hop that it needs to make from CDN point of presence to your data center where your server is running, back to the point of presence, back to the user. It's one or two less hops. It's really, really fast. They somehow managed to build this and have it be really fast and scalable. It's distributed globally, so you don't have to choose a data center. And I mentioned earlier, they've just rolled out like 0 millisecond cold starts because they're doing some cool trickery there. And Cloudflare workers have really been growing recently. Yeah, these are just the things that I just mentioned that I should have switched to this slide. Global network automatic scaling, don't need to worry about servers at all, especially if you're not, running anything on an origin, you're just hosting something directly in workers. And they have a free version and a bundled version. You can, it's a really generous free version. If you want to use key value storage, you'll want to pay $5 a month for the bundled version. But yeah, it's pretty fun. Go play with it if you want. The thing is, I just got done talking about Next.js and how great it is. I've wanted to use Next.js on Cloudflare to kind of host my React sites on Cloudflare Workers because, hey, it's at the edge. I already have all my stuff on Cloudflare. Cloudflare Workers seems really cool and modern, but unfortunately, the two technologies really don't play well together. Cloudflare Workers is built with a runtime from V8 isolates, just kind of a flavor of JavaScript engine, built for really kind of isolation. It has no access to a file system is one of the primary limitations there. And Next is built to run on a standard node server, which does have access to a file system. And so you can imagine like being able to parse out a file-based routing system with a pages directory with your React components to compile your routes. That doesn't really work in Cloudflare Workers. And so there are solutions out there like fab.dev exists where you kind of host a client bundle at a different location. And I'm not really sure how it works, but it does. And I think there are other solutions like using third-party storage, but I'm not sure that any of them match the developer experience of just spinning up a Next app. And so one week, I think back in August or September, I was like, I wonder what it would take to build a framework that worked on Cloudflare Workers. And so that's where Flareact came from. And yeah, it's been a really fun experiment. Flareact is an edge rendered React framework. It's kind of markety jargony term there. Instead of server rendered, it's edge rendered. Your application gets rendered at the edge and returned to the user right away. I mentioned file-based page routing. I think that's a killer feature in Next and a really great developer experience. And I wanted to make that work. And so I did inside Flareact. And where Next has get static props as a developer API, Flareact has get edge props, natural progression there. A lot of the APIs, in fact, all of the APIs that I built into Flareact try to mirror the Next.js developer experience and their APIs as much as possible. I think that they've done over the past few years come up with really great patterns. They have so many users and examples and figured out what works and what doesn't. And so modeling this directly after Next.js has been really great. And it's also possible, depending on how advanced your next app is, to just drop it and turn it into a Flareact app, change a couple configs, and then hit deploy, and you're good. Flareact also caches every page at the edge. Cloudflare has a cache API on top of their workers runtime. This is used for standard CDN caching, but you can use it for Flareact as well. And so this happens all automatically for you. If you write a page at /post1, the initial request is going to be a miss, but then it's going to be stored in the cache API, and then it's going to be hit from there on out. You can see, I'm trying to kind of model this after the static site generation of Next.js, and it's slightly different, right? Pages are not statically generated at deploy time. They're generated on first requests, kind of lazily generated, and then stored in the cache. Flareact also has the ability to run what Next calls the API functions. Netlify has similar concepts, but Flareact has that option as well. So you put any component inside your pages directory, sorry, not component, it's a JavaScript file inside your pages directory inside a Flareact project, and it is an API endpoint using the same HTTP fetch API that you would be writing a normal like standard JavaScript Cloudflare worker. And those are never cached because they're API endpoints. However, I also wanted to match that the incremental revalidation that Next offers. And so I, using the same exact API, except a revalidate prop from my get edge props functions. And so in this example, visitor A visits the site and it fetches those props, but it passes back a revalidate of 120. And so that is 120 seconds or 2 minutes. So a completely different visitor might visit at 3:01. So 1 minute later, it's a cache hit by that point. They got a really fast response. And then visitor C comes by at 3:05 p.m. It's been 5 minutes. Oh, it's a cache miss now because revalidate had it set at 2 minutes. So you can see how this might work for a variety of use cases, blogs, documentation sites, really anything that you're running a dynamic API behind. And that was kind of what Flareact was built to be. Here's an example of a headless WordPress demo I set up. It's available at this URL. But I'm fetching a post from the WordPress API here in my get static props. I don't know. I'm using get static props. I have a fallback. So even if you wanted to like copy your entire Next.js site over, it works. You don't have to change get static props to get edge props. It just knows automatically to check that function as well. But I am fetching the post and returning it as props, and then I'm saying revalidate this every 8 hours. And then my post page component gets a post prop, and it can render it out into the HTML. So kind of slick. It still works. I deployed it a couple months ago, and it still hasn't gone down yet. So I'm pretty proud of myself. Flareact is like definitely an experiment. It's not something it's probably ready to be used in production, but it's been fun to kind of stub some things out and try new things. This is a video of the developer experience of Flareact. Cloudflare offers a CLI tool called Wrangler, and what you're about to see here is the Flareact CLI, but Flareact under the hood calls a Wrangler process. And Wrangler is really cool because they have a dev command. And so you can run a project locally on your machine, run Wrangler dev or Flareact dev in this case, and it will actually compile your assets, send them to the Cloudflare edge somewhere in a point of presence, create a live local tunnel, and send you the results in real time. So it looks like you're developing locally, but it's actually sending it to the real production Cloudflare edge. This solves a lot of problems that I've seen pop up with serverless workflows, because you don't have the entire serverless stack available to you. If you're developing something with AWS Lambda, you can't provision an entire Lambda runtime on your machine. You probably could with like some third-party stuff, but it's really tricky. And so I think this is such a smart move by them. And so here's a video. It's probably not great quality over Zoom, but I'm starting the Flareact dev server. Here it goes. It worked, compiled some stuff, and now it's listening at this localhost port. It's rendered the doc site for Flareact, and you can see if I go into the HTML response, you'll see that it's coming from Cloudflare. There's the CF array, CF request ID, and that sort of stuff. Here's a picture of the docs site. There's lots of information, again, modeled off the Next.js about data fetching. You can do dynamic routes. So you can imagine like /post/slug, and that would be dynamically routed to whatever the slug provided was, and that would be sent to the get edge props function. Pretty handy for building out like a media or news site. API routes. CSS support is pretty limited. You can serve static files, of course, deploy to different environments, and then really customize everything about the Webpack build, and then some documentation about the built-in helpers. Flareact has its own router. I never thought I'd be building my own React router. Seems like such a silly thing to do, but I did it for this. And it kind of works. So, so today, as just a live demo, it's not a super exciting live demo, but today I want to show you an example of the power of using the edge props. And I have this PR open in my docs site repo, and I'm going to hop over to it right now. So here's the site. Click around, everything loads pretty quick, right? Right now, this is working with, this is the actual file here. It's a dynamic route for pages, docs, slug with the square brackets around it. And so I have a method called getEdgeProps. It accepts a params object, and inside those params is the slug, and that slug matches whatever the user is requesting in the URL. So today, the production site is loading with a magic Webpack dynamic import. And that's fine. It works just fine, as you can see. And then I pass that to my component, and it renders it. The issue is that my docs are in this completely separate site in Markdown files, and I have a repo, a different repo, Flareact/Flareact, that is the code. And as much as possible, I personally like to have my docs live right next to my code. That way I can release new changes and accept PRs against those and have them all in sync. So when a new version ships, it automatically updates the docs site. So what I did before this talk was I moved all the Markdown files over to my main repo and updated the remote repository. And now I have a PR open in my docs site, which deletes all those. It's all those file changes, but it fetches them with a remote API. And so let's take a look. Here is a new just docs helper. I have to pull in a Markdown parser and then Prism, which is a code highlighter, but everything else is pretty straightforward. The actual fetching happens right here. I'm fetching it from github-user-content.com, and I'm interpolating the slug, which should match whatever exists in that docs folder in my main branch. Finally, I fetch the text body, and then I run marked against that, and so that transforms it into Markdown. This is used like so. So instead of doing the Webpack dynamic import, I am simply just calling this method, which is running an AJAX fetch request. I guess not in this case, it won't be AJAX, it will be server-side fetch request. And I want this to revalidate every 5 minutes. So some nice things to drive home here is that, you know, if there's a lot of traffic on the docs site, you could imagine that maybe if I were using, GitHub might already implement this, but rate limiting for public endpoints or endpoints without API tokens passed as off. So you wouldn't want to request it every single time. Secondly, like the docs aren't changing that frequently, so it's okay to cache them for a while. And thirdly, like if I do make a change and I, fix a typo or I released a new version and I, announce it everywhere, I would want the docs to be up to date fairly quickly after that point. And so that 5-minute revalidation period is about perfect for my needs. Yeah, so I thought it would be fun to merge this and hope for the best. So a really nice thing is that we can run GitHub Actions and deploy directly to Cloudflare from there. This will take about 2 minutes if everything goes well, but yeah, so they actually use the Wrangler action under the hood and check out the repo. I have to install the node dependencies and build out the production version of our Flareact website. In the meantime, while I'm talking about this, what else can I talk about? Yeah, Flareact, this is available at flareact.com. Flareact repo is where you can go and look at the source code. Tell me what doesn't work. I don't think it works on Windows, by the way. I'm sorry. I just don't have a Windows machine to test with. And it's like a pretty developer heavy tool, so I would need an actual machine. The future of Flareact, it's like I said, it's definitely a work in progress, an experiment. I think, yeah, there's a lot to be done with the developer experience running locally. Like if you have an error in your React component, I don't think it handles it very gracefully. If you add a new page, it doesn't pick up on it. You have to like restart the dev server. So lots of stuff there that's not particularly exciting to work on. More styles and more CSS. There's React ecosystem has so many style libraries that you have to support. So trying to give a good developer experience for adding those in, just like Next has. Next has so many optimizations with how they bundle their code, with how they remove dead code, how they split up server-side code with client code. And those are done with custom Babel parsers. And I need to learn about that and try to do that as well. But some cool integrations with the other Cloudflare products, like their KV store, durable objects when those roll out. That would be kind of fun to build into Flareact to make it a really good like one-stop shop to build a site on Cloudflare Workers. So yeah, this published. It is now, it's published to Flareact.com. So let's go take a look. It seems to be working, so that's great. I can go to other pages and they load just fine, so that's fun. Let's take a look under the hood. If I click here on deployment, I get a JSON file. That's my props loading. I see that those have an age header, so that means that they're being cached and that the max age is 14,000 seconds. I'm not exactly sure what that adds up to, but it was cached in the Cloudflare cache. And yeah, it works 50 milliseconds to load all that stuff. And these are all being driven from a remote GitHub repository now. So it worked. That is Flareact. Very quick introduction, but that's all I have for today. Happy to answer any questions.